them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Hey. Run them jewels fast, Run them jewels fast. Run them jewels fast. Run them slow mo.
Should be very easy to get now.
Yes, I believe so. I'm not doing it online, but okay, yeah, sure. Who's listening to that?
No, they're putting it on the speaker.
Oh, Christ.
Okay, that should be easy to get. I can get it in a day.
That's what I'm hoping to
Yeah.
get it today, yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
After all these years.
I should have done it years ago, because Barbara and I have been married 55 years. So, you know, I could have done it 55 years ago, right? But now all my kids have it, she has it, it's time I got it, you know? Better late than never.
It'll be a touching moment when you do.
Yes, it will. Yeah, I hope there'll be a little ceremony or something. Yeah.
That's great. You can, as for what it's worth, you can travel visa-free throughout the Caribbean. But you can
And to Russia. I can go to Russia.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. And maybe Schengen in the future.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I have for you. Will Taiwan exist in 10 years?
run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo.
Welcome to Uncut with Jules Vasquez, where we delve into the issues shaping our country and region. Jules Vasquez is a leading Belizean journalist and commentator known for his hard-hitting interviews and fearless scrutiny of public figures. He received the inaugural Belize Prize for Investigative Journalism in 2023 and again in 2024. Vasquez is widely respected for his commitment to press freedom and his impact on Belize's media landscape. Today's guest is one of the world's foremost experts on Latin America and the Caribbean, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas. He's a former director of Chatham House and the Institute of Latin American Studies in London, and author of influential works like The Economic History of Latin America Since Independence. His recent research on U.S. power and its impact on the Caribbean is especially relevant as Belize faces a shifting global landscape in the era of a renewed Trump presidency. With deep ties to Belize and a sharp understanding of the forces shaping our region, we are honored to welcome Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas to this special edition of Uncut, hosted by Jules Vasquez.
thank everyone for coming, and thank you, my guest, Victor Bulmer-Thomas, who you just saw introduced. Thanks for being here, Victor.
It's a pleasure.
The introduction alluded to your long history in Belize, but it did not say that you came here as a VSO at the age of 18, and you had a very special crop of students.
I did.
You taught at St. Michael's College. You taught Dean Barrow?
Yes.
Or he was in school at the time?
I did teach him. I did teach him. I
With
still have his
Ellington
mark
as
book.
well? Say again?
I still have his mark book.
There you go. you have the evidence. So Victor has a very long history in Belize, and that is what led you to specialize in studies throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. It first started in Belize.
That's right.
And that is, without being unkind, 60 years ago of study.
Yes, it's 60 years next year. Yeah, yeah.
Now, your most recent book is Empire in Retreat. As an economic historian, explain to me what you mean when you say that the U.S. is an empire in retreat. Is the geopolitical importance of the United States diminishing right before our eyes?
It is. And I think it's important to remember that the US has always been an empire. But its empire was based on territory and colonies, places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, even Alaska and Hawaii until recently. But that territorial empire came to an end after the Second World War, when the US transformed itself into what I call a semi-global empire. It was never global because obviously it couldn't include the Soviet Union and its allies, but it was certainly semi-global, and the basis of it were the institutions that the US had formed at the end of the Second World War. Things like the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, NATO, the Organization of American States, all these institutions. And so I actually refer to it after the Second World War as an institutional empire, not a territorial empire, an institutional empire. And that brings us on to this whole issue of imperial retreat, because the US has lost and is losing control and influence in those institutions that it created at the end of the Second World War. And in response to that loss of control and influence, it is resorting more and more to military campaigns, military power, hard power, if you like. And the problem with hard power, as exercised by the United States in the last 30 years, is that it starts well, from their point of view, in terms of regime change, and it always ends badly. So whether you look at Bosnia in 1995, or Serbia in 1999, or Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, I could go on, and perhaps even Iran in this year, who knows? The initial enthusiasm, because of regime change, soon comes to a close. And look today at Afghanistan. The people that the US removed in 2001 are back in power. Look at Syria. They removed President Assad, and who has replaced him? The man who was number one on their own terrorist list until very, very recently. So these wars, most of which, let's be honest, are illegal under the international law that the US itself promoted after the Second World War, these wars have done terrible damage to the reputation of the United States. And what that means is they have undermined the soft power, not the hard power, the soft power on which all empires depend. The soft power is when, by virtue of your example, you persuade other countries to stay in line, to follow what you are requesting them to do, and so on. The soft power of the United States is collapsing, even as you and I are talking now. So those are the three things that have underpinned the imperial retreat, but there's one more, in some ways the most important of all, and that is the change in the nature of the economy. Because at the end of the war, the Second World War, the US was what we call a trade surplus country. it had a huge surplus in the balance of payments. And that meant that it had accumulation of dollars, which it then shipped out in the form of foreign loans, foreign direct investment, in the process building up influence and power for the United States. That changed in the 1970s. And since then, the US has been a deficit country. So it's the rest of the world that's accumulating the dollars. And that includes adversaries of the United States, like China. So the US is now dependent on those countries recycling their dollars into the United States by buying up US treasuries, by helping to increase the debt of the United States, by buying up real estate, property, things like that. And the problem with that is it works fine as long as everyone has confidence in the US dollar. But they no longer do. And so the dollar is weakening, the interest rates that they demand to hold US treasuries has been rising, and the share of the US dollar in international reserves has fallen quite sharply. So I'm sorry to have gone on longer than I should, Jules, but essentially those are the four reasons why I talk about imperial retreat.
The US is increasingly adopting a stance of insularity. You speak about soft power. You came to Belize as a VSO, and that is really the soft underbelly of the British Empire, in the same way the US Peace Corps, for example, is an extension of the soft power of the United States. But the increasing insularity and the closure to the outside world, and when they cut off programs, such as the MCC grant, the Millennium Challenge grant, here in Belize, how does that further erode the power of the US and give rise to other powers who want to exert influences in countries such as Belize?
Well, as long as we have a situation where low and middle income countries are reliant on foreign assistance in one form or another, we know that nature abhors a vacuum. So if the US pulls out, other countries will want to move in. And for Belize, it's obviously a question now of trying to find other sources of other funders who will be able to step in where the United States once provided funds.
Who are we talking about? Russia, China?
Neither of those are very likely at the moment. China isn't going to be particularly generous while Belize recognizes Taiwan. And of course, Russia has its own agenda at the moment, and no doubt we'll be talking about that later. But there are countries in the Gulf. I mean, for example, Jules, you will know the principal position that Belize has taken on the Palestine issue. It's been extremely brave. It's had to roll back a little bit, I know, withdrawing from the Hague group. But the fact is that Belize's position on the Palestine issue and the resistance to the genocide in Gaza has been noted throughout the Muslim world. Well, some of these countries are immensely wealthy. Saudi Arabia already donates to Belize, but there are plenty of others in the Gulf that do not. So there is definitely an opportunity for Belize.
Now, one of the fundamental powers that is dominant right now in the US is the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. It may sound simplistic, but it's really a very strong expression of American nationalism, or some would say white supremacist ideation or nationalism. Explain to me, what is the appeal of MAGA within the US context right now? Why is it so intoxicating that it was able to bring President Trump to power?
To understand MAGA, you have to understand globalization. This is the process by which the US drove forward for the last 50 years the reduction in barriers to trade, to capital flows, took a more lenient view of inward migration, and so on. And in some ways, that brought benefits to the US economy as a whole, but those benefits were very unequally distributed. And the shift in income inequality, and in particular wealth inequality in the United States in the last 30, 40 years has been absolutely astonishing. And the result is that what you might call the bottom 50 or 60% of households have not felt any improvement in their living standards. And they cannot understand why, if the US is supposed to be the greatest economy in the world, why it is that those benefits have not reached them. What they've seen is the loss of high-paid manufacturing jobs, which have been outsourced to other parts of the world. And they instead of focusing their anger on what you might call the billionaire ruling class in the United States, they've focused their anger on undocumented migrants, which is very, very unfair. But that, of course, is the opportunity that Trump seized in order to win their support. So essentially, you have a very strange coalition behind Donald Trump. It's all presidential administrations are coalitions, we know that. But I would say the Trumpian coalition is the strangest of all. In some ways, it's completely dysfunctional because the billionaires who support him and who make up half of his cabinet and who provided the funding along with the Zionists for his campaign, they have nothing in common with these MAGA voters. Right. But the MAGA crowd, they provide the votes. You can't win without them. So the sort of Faustian bargain that Trump has struck is that he will pay attention to the needs of the MAGA crowd, particularly when it comes to reversing migration flows, but also by throwing them crumbs. Look at the tax bill going through now. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. That's what the MAGA group want to hear. What they don't want to hear is about forever wars. They do not want Trump to start new wars. But unfortunately, there are plenty of people in that billionaire and Zionist ruling class who do want more wars. So there is tension within the coalition.
What has you're a former director of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, known as the Chatham House. Is the election of Trump overall a good thing for the world, or would the world, the global environment, be better off if Vice President Harris had been elected president?
Well, before the election last November, I thought about the parts of the world where conflicts could possibly lead to nuclear war. And there are three. One was Russia-Ukraine, one was Israel-Palestine and the whole Middle East, and the other was the tension between the US and China over Taiwan and the South China Sea and so on. Of course, there are many other conflicts, the civil war in Sudan, for example, but that is not going to lead to nuclear war. It's an old-fashioned proxy war, if you like, the kind that we're familiar with from the Cold War. But there were these three flashpoints. I took the view that if Harris was elected president, there would be frankly no change in any of them. The situation would remain very tense in Russia-Ukraine, very tense in the Middle East, with the unconditional support being given to Israel, and very tense with regard to China, where the Biden administration, and presumably later on the Harris administration, would have been pushing somehow for Taiwanese independence. We weren't there yet, but it struck me as a real risk, because that would obviously lead to war with China. If Trump was elected, I took the view that the situation in the Middle East would either remain the same or get worse, which it has. That the situation, however, in Russia-Ukraine would definitely improve, in the sense that the United States would not make the mistake of the previous presidents, not just Biden, but Obama as well, of refusing to recognize that Russia had genuine security interests, and that it was not just a crude, old-fashioned land grab that was going on. I think Trump got that. I think he still gets it. But of course, because of his coalition, there are all kinds of problems to work out. But I think he'll get there in the end, and I think he will withdraw support from that particular conflict.
He will withdraw support from Ukraine?
Yes.
And allow Russia to have its way?
Yes. Of course, he will dress it up as leaving it to the Europeans. He'll say, this is a European conflict. It's now up to the Europeans, if they want to take on Russia, and provide the support to Ukraine that previously was done by the United States. But he himself will withdraw that, and the key, of course, is he wants to normalize relations with Russia. And in my view, the normalization of relations in the US and Russia is an extremely good thing, because it opens the door to resolving various other conflicts, including, of course, the one with Iran.
How do you see the issue of the UK vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the emerging position of the United States via that same conflict? They are polar opposites in their approach to this.
Totally. And I have to say, I find the policy of the UK government, my government, incomprehensible. But to understand it, you have to realize the depth of Russophobia, hostility to Russia in some parts of Europe and certainly in the UK. You and I could not have this conversation in London. We'd be shut down immediately. It's just not possible to talk about Russia and Ukraine in a way that is open and frankly fair to both sides. So if, for example, I say that Russia was provoked, being provoked doesn't necessarily justify Russia's military intervention. That's a separate issue. But if I say Russia was provoked, people will scream at me and say, what are you talking about? It's an unprovoked war. That's ridiculous. Everybody knows that there was provocation. The question is whether that justified Russian intervention. So I think
but specify what the provocation is. Is the provocation NATO's encircling of Russia? Is it?
Yes, it
Explain.
is. That's the main one. Well, the thing about NATO is that whatever they tell you in Western Europe, there was a promise made to Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand once it had integrated East and West Germany. There would be no movement NATO eastwards towards the frontier of Russia. But there was no treaty. Now people think, well, if there's no treaty, there's no obligation. That's not true. Often in the Cold War, the two sides made agreements that were not written down, but they were respected. Gorbachev, perhaps naively, thought that that was the case in terms of the agreements that he had reached with various Western leaders, including in the US, Germany, France, and Britain. But of course, within a few years, President Clinton had decided that, well, Russia was so weak, there was no need to pay any attention to the state that had emerged out of the Soviet Union. And by the end of the 1990s, the first wave of expansion had happened. But the Russians were not in a position to respond. They were only in a position to respond a few years later. And there was a famous speech that Putin gave in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, by which time there had already been several waves of NATO enlargement. And he was an honored guest at this occasion, as he often had been, and he gave a speech, and the audience was absolutely stunned into silence. He said, this NATO expansion has to stop. This is a threat to our security. How would you feel if we expanded up to your borders, in Mexico, Canada, etc., etc.? And the next year, what did NATO do under pressure from President George W. Bush? They offered a path to membership to NATO of Georgia and Ukraine. I mean, how foolish can you get? And so really, the Ukraine war, the roots of the Ukraine war can be found in that moment. It then accelerated with the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, which had the fingerprints of the CIA all over it. And then, of course, Russia did what it could to reach some kind of an accommodation, both with Ukraine and with the United States and with the NATO member, the European members of NATO. Nothing worked. And then, of course, you get the invasion in 2022. So provocation, yes. Whether that was sufficient to justify, that's something that, people have different opinions upon. But there was severe provocation.
Now, if we can switch to economics, the US has launched a tariff war, a trade war globally. We see this, and it looks irrational, it looks chaotic. But do you believe there is a guiding strategy behind this constant threat of new tariffs, revocation of those tariffs, application of new tariffs? It seems chaotic. Is there a method to the madness?
Yes, there is. But it's interesting that because we talked earlier about the Trump coalition and how dysfunctional it is in many ways. And so often, things that happen in this administration, they do look completely chaotic and illogical and incoherent. But it is a function of the president having to balance off the competing interests of these different groups. Now, if we take the tariffs...
You mean of the billionaires?
Yes.
And the MAGA
crowd. That's not an easy combination to handle, right? So if you take the tariffs, Trump, of course, has always been in favor of tariffs. He took out a huge advert in the New York Times in 1987. 1987, that's 40 years ago, complaining about the creation of the WTO and US participation in that. So he's been always consistent. His great hero is President McKinley, who took in the 1890s US tariffs to a much higher level than had existed before. The second highest in the world, after Russia, actually, as it happens. Trump has always believed in tariffs. And now he has the MAGA crowd pushing for the return of manufacturing into the United States. Well, tariffs is one of the ways in which you do that. But it also will raise revenue. And that meets another target of Trump, which is to try and bring, at least in theory, the fiscal deficit under control. When you import $4 trillion worth of goods and you have a 10% tariff on everything, well, that alone is $400 billion. So the tariff revenue could be considerable. So there is a certain logic to this. Restore protection for the manufacturing sector, create high value-added jobs for the MAGA crowd, and then hope to increase the revenue for the federal government.
But with all the vacillation, will he succeed in achieving his target?
In achieving what?
In achieving his objective.
Well, obviously, the way in which he's handled the negotiations has been not a pretty sight. But at the end of it, the tariffs that the US applies will be definitely higher than what they are now. So, at the very least, there'll be 10% on just about everything, and much higher on goods from places like China.
How do you see a country like Belize being affected? And in this context, I should mention that the authoritative history of the economic history of Belize, one of my go-to books, is written by Barbara Bulmer-Thomas in the audience, your wife, and Victor Bulmer-Thomas. But a country with a long extractive and exploitative economic history such as Belize, how do we stand to be affected by these tariffs?
Well, as it stands at the moment, Belize exports of goods has been hit by the minimum 10% tariff. Of course, Belize now exports more services than it does goods, so I'll come back to that. But if we just refer to the goods, the sugar, the bananas, and things like that, these are goods which, of course, the US imports from other parts of the world, but they are also hit with at least a 10% tariff, in some cases more. So there shouldn't be any trade diversion from Belize to, I don't know, Guatemala or Ecuador as a result of the tariffs. The problem is if Belize is exporting goods which can be produced in the United States. They can't produce bananas, but they can produce sugar. So it's possible that you would get a shift away from Belize as a result of protective tariffs. So there are risks for Belize when it comes to commodity exports, but there are no tariffs on services. And so since what Belize mainly exports is services, at the moment Belize is in the clear as far as that's concerned. That doesn't mean there won't be problems down the line, and we know that the tourist arrivals from the United States are not quite what was being hoped for or expected in recent weeks. But that's not to do with tariffs. That's simply to do with the uncertainty and the uncertain economic conditions in the United States.
Is there in this an opportunity for Belize to break away from the imperial hegemony of the United States, which has controlled Belize's economy for much of the last century?
Well, there are always opportunities, but there are also obviously also risks. Certainly, diversification should be one of the central strategies in any government, Belizean government economic policy. It's very, very risky to be in a situation where all your services are exported to one particular source. In the case of goods exports, actually Belize has quite a diversified range of partners. They go not just to the US, they go to CARICOM, they go to Central America, they go to Europe and so on. But in the case of services, there is a very heavy reliance on tourism from the United States. That probably does need to be diversified, and maybe more of an effort should be put into trying to achieve that.
The free trade principles that the entire neoliberal world order operates under, how are these new tariffs that Trump proposes, how are those violating the neoliberal order? And we have to understand that those neoliberal policies have also led to the extraction of wealth and resources from the global south, countries like Belize. How is his new approach, how is the Trump trade approach in violation of those principles?
Oh, completely. There's no question about that. And they're not just in violation of international rules set up by the World Trade Organization, they're almost certainly in violation of domestic US laws, because tariffs is a new source of government revenue which has to be approved by Congress. So there's a big battle going through the courts right now in the United States over whether Trump has the legal right to just raise tariffs in this way.
Executive authority.
Exactly. And so that's one of the big constitutional issues in the United States, which won't be resolved for some time. But as far as the the violation of international rules is concerned, of course the normal situation would be that the WTO would call a arbitration panel or set up a judicial process. But the judicial side of the WTO has been undermined, not just by Trump, but by previous US presidents as well. So there's nothing there to work with.
So these new tariffs continue in blatant repudiation of these world trade, these seminal world trade principles.
Yes.
Is the ascent of MAGA to an extent and the rise of nationalists and right-wing leaders all over the world, is it an uprising really against this globalism that we were fed 20 years ago as being, it will create a more equitable global trade landscape with opportunities for everyone? Of course, it was a lie. And the poor people and the middle class are suffering worldwide because of it. So they are electing populist leaders who they feel will hold their national values more closely. Is this all a backlash against globalism and this global world order?
Oh yes, to a considerable extent. I mean, there are other factors, and each country there are specifics that you have to take into account. But what I think we're seeing is definitely the collapse of that neoliberal, globalized world order. It's not going to come back. It's not just in the United States. You have too many countries where the electorate want to move away from that. Now that's when it gets tricky, because Trump has recognized that this phase of US global hegemony has come to an end. He doesn't articulate it well,
Right,
but some of those around him, like J.D. Vance, his vice president, like Tulsi Gabbard, his director of national intelligence, even Marco Rubio, amazingly, the Secretary of State, they talk about the emergence of a multipolar world. Now, this is something the Russians and Chinese, and indeed the Indians, have been talking about for a long time. But this is the first time leaders in the US have talked about a multipolar world. Now, this is something that is coming. We know it's coming. The BRICS organization, that perhaps we'll talk about later, is in a way a reflection of that. The trouble is that Trump wants to have his cake and eat it. He's happy to move towards a multipolar world, but he still wants to keep US global hegemony, and that's not possible. So it may have to wait for another president in the United States to understand better exactly what a multipolar world is. A multipolar world is when these powerful countries, at the moment it would be the US, Russia and China, come together to forge a new global order which takes into account economic interests, security interests, and all the rest of it. There would have to be new treaties, new organizations, and arms control treaties and all that sort of stuff. We're not there yet. So in the meantime, this is where it gets very dangerous for Belize, unfortunately, because in the meantime, Trump and some of those in his cabinet are interpreting this emerging multipolar world as meaning spheres of influence. Now, we all know what that means. Of course, in the case of the US, it means the Americas. This is the sphere where US law will be, undisputed, where US will be undisputed. Hence all the talk about the Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada becoming the 51st state, all the rest of it. But if you were to apply that literally, then obviously whose sphere of influence would Russia have? Well, it would clearly include Ukraine. But whose sphere of influence would China have? Well, it would clearly include Taiwan. So this notion of a multipolar world, as interpreted by Trump, is a little incoherent, which is why, as I said before, we probably will have to wait for a future president to give it some sort of coherence and work towards a new set of institutions and treaties that will avoid chaos in the world system.
But we are witnessing, would you concede, a reconfiguration of the global order, at least in terms of trade and economics?
A reconfiguration or a
reconfiguration of the global economy?
Yes, definitely, yes. I mean, it's clear that there will be more protection. By the way, Jules, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because if, like me, you're an economic historian, you will know that there have been waves of globalization in the last 500 years, even longer actually, during which barriers to trade and capital flows and the flows of people have been diminished. And then after a certain point there's a reaction and those protective barriers are restored. And for those with shorter memories, all we have to do is think about the period before the First World War, not the Second. Before the First World War, there was a massive wave of globalization, huge movements of goods and capital and people all around the world. And that came crashing down in the First World War, and you had the protective system reimposed in between the two world wars. That ended very badly. So let's hope that this time the reversal of the current phase of globalization does not end as badly as what happened nearly 100 years ago.
If it were to end, we are seeing it end, but what is the greatest risk for a small, vulnerable, services-based economy like Belize?
Well, I mentioned the risk in the case of goods, which is that the US decides to produce things like sugar itself rather than importing it from around the world. The risk in the case of services is that they might come up with some way of restricting US citizens from traveling to different parts of the world for whatever reason, either to punish Belize or for could be any kind of reason. My bigger worry, though, for Belize is this spheres of influence thing, because if the US is really going to interpret a multipolar world, the emerging multipolar world, as meaning that it will have its sphere of influence in the Americas, then that potentially restricts the degrees of freedom that Belize will have. We're not there yet, but it's something, if I was in the Belize government, I would be very concerned about.
What will it look like? What will the world look like if you can peer into your crystal ball? What will the world look like at the end of Trump 2.0?
That's an extremely difficult question.
It's even hard to know what it's going to look like at the end of the week.
Well, I do think, coming back to the 3-point flashpoints, which potentially could have ended in a nuclear war, I'm fairly sure that the Ukraine-Russia war will have ended by the end of the Trump administration.
Will have ended with Ukraine losing a major portion of its territory.
Yes, yes.
Having to cede a major portion of its territory.
But this is not about territory. This is about NATO not expanding into Ukraine. Remember that the point is this. Once you're in NATO, you're under the protection of Article 5. That means that all the other members of NATO have to come to your defense if you're attacked. Now, if Ukraine had joined NATO, the next thing, and Antony Blinken said this to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, very clearly, is we will have NATO bases in Ukraine, and there will be missiles in those bases, and we're willing to negotiate with you about the number of missiles, but we're not willing to negotiate with you about whether there will be missiles or whether there will be bases. And so the Russians are thinking, well, hang on a minute. If we wait till Ukraine joins NATO, then if we are faced with some major provocation and we try and do something, we're attacking NATO. We will then trigger Article 5, and the whole of the NATO countries will be coming to get us. So we have to tackle this problem beforehand. So they launched what's called a preventive war. It's not legal, but let's be honest, Jules, most wars since the Second World War have not been legal. And I listed all the US military campaigns which have been illegal as well. So a preventive war, as opposed to a preemptive war, that is not legal. And so it would be difficult to justify Russia's actions in terms of international law. But it happened, and now we have to deal with it. So trying to answer your question, yes, that war will come to an end because Trump is willing to concede the security concerns that Russia faces, and in return, for normalizing relations with Russia, he is looking for economic opportunities in the Russian Federation. He's looking for Russian help in places like Iran, and above all, he's hoping to weaken the link between Russia and China. I don't think he'll succeed, but that is one of his aims.
Excellent. We'll take our first commercial break now. In our second part of our conversation on this show, which I should have named at the outset, it is how does Belize navigate a path for itself in the Trump era? In our second portion of our show, we will look more closely at Belize's interests, its economic interests, its geopolitical interests, and how we can navigate this path most successfully, even in context of the ICJ and the unfounded Guatemalan claim on Belize. We take our first break, UnCut live from the University of Belize. We'll be right back.
Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo.
Welcome back to UnCut. Welcome back to UnCut. Our second portion. Thank you. In the second half of our show, we're joined again by Victor Bulmer-Thomas. And in the second part of our show, in the first half, we spoke mostly about the global implications of Trump, but where the purpose of the show is talking about Belize navigating a path for itself in the Trump era. And we want to try to bring the conversation a little more specifically closer to home. Belize, we always speak about our sovereignty, our autonomy. These are sacred principles, but the fact is that every facet of our governance and our economy is presided over or actuated to some extent by the United States. They are the hegemon in this hemisphere. So we have to look at ourselves in that context, but do we have to first disabuse ourselves of the illusion of autonomy and sovereignty when a hegemon presides over us?
If you look at the Americas, you can see that there are 3 or 4 ways of dealing with this issue. One is what I call being a vassal. That is to say, a country which, when the United States says jump, says how high. And there are plenty of examples of that. El Salvador in Central America, Ecuador in South America, there are others. Then there are those who are brave enough to face confrontation and to live with the consequences. We know the case of Cuba. Increasingly, we see the case of Bolivia. There's obviously the case of Venezuela, and more worryingly now is the case of Colombia, where there does seem to be growing confrontation between the United States and a particular Latin American country. To be honest, I don't think Belize should go down either of these paths. It doesn't need to be a vassal, and it certainly shouldn't choose the path of confrontation. So what does that leave open? The answer is partnerships and cooperation through international organizations. And I think if I could start with the latter, Belize is a member of many international or regional organizations, CARICOM, SICA, the OAS, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean, say CELAC. Of these, at the moment, the most effective is been CARICOM, and CARICOM is what helped Belize to deal with the issue of the Cuban doctors. I think if Belize had tried to do that on its own, it would have been impossible. But by using partners in CARICOM who had the same issues, it worked quite effectively. But there'll be other issues where Belize is a bit isolated and where it probably does need additional support. SICA, of course, is not functioning at the moment because the divisions between, say, El Salvador on the one hand and Nicaragua on the other are just so intense that you can't get any kind of serious agreement. CELAC, unfortunately, is also riven by major divisions. But I do think that there are other areas in which Belize could work. And one of the things that Belize should think about, obviously it can't do anything about it immediately, is this question of becoming a partner in the BRICS alliance. Now, BRICS, although it only has 5 countries in the acronym, that's to say Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now has 10 members, but it has another 10, 15, I can't remember the exact number, partner countries, some of which are in Latin America. And these partner countries then get a certain amount of protection, if you like, for the issues on which they find themselves in disagreement with the United States. The problem is that there's no way in which Belize could become a BRICS partner while it recognizes Taiwan. And so if that's the most important thing for Belize, then it rules out BRICS partnership. But if that is something that comes up for discussion in the future, well then the BRICS route is a possibility. I throw that out knowing that this is a very sensitive issue, and I'm not going to pick a side in this. But I do think Belizeans need to think about it, because it's not just a question of who will give us more money, Taiwan or the People's Republic of China. That's not the way to look at this. You have to think strategically, you have to think long term. And the question is, which of those 2 countries is going to serve the interests of Belize better going forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
And we don't have to look long term. In the near or medium term, Belize has to, or do you believe that Belize has to ask itself the question, will Taiwan exist in 20 years?
Well, exist as what?
Exist as what we regarded as, 13 countries regarded as, an independent state with self-determination.
Well, just to be clear, Belize is recognizing Taiwan not as an independent state, but as the representative of the whole of China.
Yes, that is true, which is impossible.
Exactly, but that is the fiction, if you like,
yes,
of recognizing Taiwan. So that status quo, it's possible that it will still be there in 10 years, but were the United States, under Trump or the next president, to push the issue in trying to push Taiwan towards declaring independence, then there would be war. And in that war, China would occupy Taiwan and take back what it regards as its rightful inheritance. So there wouldn't be a Taiwan in the sense that you've just described if the US goes to war with China. Now, personally, I don't think that will happen. And the reason I don't think that happen is not that the US doesn't go to war. We know it does. It's already at war, effectively, with Iran, even as we're speaking. But China has shown itself to be a much more serious competitor than the United States realized. It's shown that with the tariff war this year. But let's not forget that China became the biggest economy in the world in 2014, 11 years ago. If you measure it correctly, instead of using official exchange rates, you use what's called purchasing power parity exchange rates. China is the biggest economy in the world, and the gap between it and the United States just keeps growing. It's the biggest exporter in the world, and now, because of the impact of tariffs on US imports, it'll soon probably become the biggest importer in the world. So the idea that the US can go to war with China to somehow, protect Taiwanese independence is becoming increasingly absurd. And that's why I actually think that the current situation in which China and Taiwan coexist, with each claiming to represent the whole of China, can be sustained for some time. China plays a very long game, far longer than any other country that we know. Millennial. And so when China, as long as China doesn't see a declaration of independence, it's perfectly happy to work with the current status quo, incorporating Taiwan into its economy, building closer relations with the people there, and so on.
However, Belize has to be cautious because it is in the geopolitical interests of the United States that Belize remains an ally of Taiwan and not China. We know the US is watching very closely the increasing influence of the Chinese in this hemisphere.
Absolutely. And that's why a unilateral move by Belize would be very, very risky. So now I'm going to throw out to you something which you'll probably think is completely crazy. And if that's true, I fully accept that. But what is another country that recognizes Taiwan as the representative of China that is close to Belize? It's Guatemala. And sometime in the next year or two, as a result of the ruling of the International Court of Justice, that dispute, that territorial and maritime differendum between Belize and Guatemala is going to disappear. Now, if you're going to switch from Taiwan to China, the best way to do it is with other countries. So we're not talking about something this year. We're talking about a moment when Belize and Guatemala no longer have a territorial and maritime dispute to divide them. That might be a moment to give it further thought.
So, do you believe these two countries remain locked in with Taiwan because they don't want to offend the hemispheric hegemon?
Yes.
Yes. So
if the United States sent a signal that do what you want, we don't care, I think both countries will by now have switched their support to the People's Republic of China. I do believe that, yeah.
Interesting theory. One of the things that President Trump always says is that we're being ripped off. We're being ripped off. And that's why he has started these trade wars. But when you tell a poor, subordinate, vassal economy like Belize that you, the wealthiest country in the world, is being ripped off, when we are the ones who are the victims of the exploitative capitalistic system which you have enforced throughout this hemisphere and the world. Who's right and who is wrong in this? Are they really being ripped off, or are we the ones who were ripped off?
No, of course the US is not being ripped off. And let me explain to you why. Because this comes down to some very basic macroeconomics, which every economist knows, but unfortunately we've never found a way of explaining it to non-economists. When a country runs a current account deficit, a big one, the size of the United States, what it means is it's spending more than it's earning. And that means that its domestic savings are insufficient for the purposes of its investment. That's the situation you have in the United States. And why does it have such a large current account and low domestic savings? Because of its enormous fiscal deficit. A fiscal deficit, by the way, which is about to grow even bigger if this budget bill goes through Congress, the one that President Trump has proposed.
Big, beautiful bill.
This big, beautiful bill. Mm-hmm. So the US runs this current account deficit because it spends more than it earns. Now, of course, if you spend more than you earn, you run a current account deficit, then somewhere else in the world there will be countries with surpluses, by definition. Those countries are mainly Japan, China, and Germany. Two friends of the United States, one supposedly an adversary. But these surpluses are not there because those countries wickedly set about accumulating surpluses. I mean, remember, two of them are friends of the United States, close allies. It's a consequence of the US spending more than it earns. It's done it for 50 years, and it seems to be absolutely addicted to it. Hence this growing fiscal deficit. Unless something is done about that, then the current account deficit will remain, and the US will continue to complain about being ripped off. But there's no truth to it whatsoever.
Speak about tourism. We speak about the services sector, and our economy has shifted. You have done the authoritative history on our economy, and it has shifted in perhaps in modality, in the nature of extractive wealth. But essentially the system remains. If one looks into who owns the means of wealth production under tourism. But speak, if you can, about Belize's dependence on the US economy and US tourism spending for the sustenance of our economy and for tourism as this vaunted foreign exchange earner?
Well, it's absolutely massive. We don't, unfortunately, the Belize statistical authorities know about the geographical destination of goods exports, but they haven't got the same precision about the geographical destination of service exports. But we know from the number of tourists that come here that it's mainly from the United States. And you only have to look at the flight paths and the flights coming into Belize every day to realize that that must be true. So Belize has built an economy which could be summarized as two words: sugar, tourists. And that essentially captures the slightly narrow thinking of public policy in Belize, because if this is what your economy is, then clearly the future depends on increasing the number of tourists and increasing the volume of sugar exports. And both of those are very, very difficult because, as you know, with sugar, it's such a political commodity. It's governed by all complicated rules and subsidies and protection and everywhere. That Belize is just not in a position to double the export of sugar, for example, in 5 years or something like that. But with tourists, theoretically, you can. The trouble is that you do not control the circumstances in countries from where the tourists come. And we now realize that this MAGA crowd, not just the MAGA crowd, but some people who vote Democrat as well, are deeply concerned about that.
I think we just need a backup microphone here, perhaps for Victor. Let's take a small commercial break. I think we just had unless we have it's up?
Okay.
I think we can proceed. I'm sorry. It went down briefly. But yes, please continue. You were saying tourism.
I was saying, so you think you have a secure source of tourists because the numbers have grown for the last few years, but you do not control what happens in that country. And we've now seen in the United States how the turbulence associated with the Trump economic policy is affecting the way people in the United States spend their money. So Belize has to diversify its service exports, not just its goods exports.
Right, because it is almost like a monocrop economy where tourism is the crop.
Yes.
And so we find ourselves in the same vulnerability that, for example, the PUP government of 1979 to 1984 found itself in with sugar when world sugar prices crashed. At the time, we were a monocrop economy.
Yes.
And we were told, you need to diversify to a services economy. We have diversified to a services economy. Everything, tourism is an economic godhead. And now we are realizing that we built our house a house of straw, because once the North American market, once it turns its attention from Belize, or it loses its economic upward mobility, then we're in trouble again. This is a cycle.
Yes, but there are solutions. It's not a hopeless situation. We'll come to that in a minute. But before we started the interview, Jules, you and I were talking about a book I wrote about the Caribbean, and it's called From Slavery to Services, The Struggle for Economic Independence in the Caribbean. And the point that I was trying to make there is the Caribbean countries, not just Belize, have always been searching, ever since the end of slavery, for a way in which they could make their economies less vulnerable, less at risk of shocks coming from outside. Now, Belize has made this commitment to services. I don't think it has much choice about that. I'm not one who believes that Belize can become self-sufficient, not with a population of 400,000. But within services, there are two things you can do. One, I've always gone on about this all my adult life, is you can diversify service exports. They don't just have to be tourists. There are lots of countries around the Caribbean that have...
But we tried IBCs.
Yes, but you have to keep trying. I always give the example of Costa Rica, because when I was working on this topic in Costa Rica, and they were trying to diversify their service exports, they came up with an incredible notion.
Microphone? Are we good? We can proceed, yeah?
They have persuaded some of the big US airlines on the East Coast, instead of flying them to the West Coast to be serviced every month or whatever it is, they would fly them to Costa Rica to be serviced. The distance is roughly the same. The cost was much less. And so Costa Rica had developed a significant earning stream from service exports, from repair and maintenance of jet aircraft. I'm not saying Belize can do that. I'm just saying that you have to be imaginative, and the best place to start is by looking at all the service exports in the Caribbean and Central America and looking at which might actually work, other than tourism.
So we need to end this slavish dependency and idealization of tourism as the only way forward.
But tourism will be part of that service mix.
Yes,
It's
of
just
course.
that within tourism, there needs to be a diversification so that Belize is not so dependent on the tourists coming from one particular place. There are lots of tourist markets, and the BTB is much better than me to identify them, but there are lots of places from which Belize could obtain tourists on a regular basis that could diversify the origin of tourists who come to Belize. South America is an obvious example.
What, if any, aspects of our foreign policy do we need to adjust, does Belize need to adjust in order to not attract the ire of President Trump or Secretary of State Rubio?
Well, the obvious issue here of concern, as you will know, is Palestine. Belize has been very principled, very brave on the issue of Palestine.
Were we wise to step back from the Hague Group?
Belize must do what it feels is right. And in the case of stepping back from the Hague Group, I don't feel I can really pass judgment on that. The fact is that Belize did break diplomatic relations with Israel. It has gone out of a limb. It has attached itself to the South African case alleging genocide by Israel in Gaza. These are all very brave steps. I don't think there's any need for Belize to feel embarrassed about stepping back from the Hague Group. But of course, this is an issue which potentially could get it into trouble with the Trump administration, and Belize therefore needs friends on this particular issue. There are many countries in CELAC, for example, who take the same position. Colombia broke diplomatic relations with Israel in exactly the same way. So Belize is not isolated on this issue, but it needs to build coalitions within groups like CELAC that will help protect it against the possible ire of the United States.
You speak about the Israel-Gaza situation. Has this war, Israel's war on Gaza, has it exposed the absolute ineffectuality of the ICJ?
No, I don't agree with that.
But Europe, the United States, all these powers, they take it as a joke.
I'll tell you why I don't agree with that. I think often people confuse, not you, often people confuse the ICJ with the ICC. They confuse the International Criminal Court with the International Court of Justice. Now, the ICC, I can understand why people are much more cynical or skeptical about that body, because until they went after the Prime Minister of Israel and his former defense secretary, they were mainly concerned with indicting leaders in Africa who were considered too weak to fight back and all the rest of it. And when the ICC went after the leaders in Israel, it was thought, how dare you? You know, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. And so the ICC has now got itself into a very difficult situation. I don't know whether it will be able to survive. I hope it does. But most countries, many countries, the powerful countries like the United States, Russia, China, Israel itself, they don't recognize the ICCC anyway. Now, the ICJ is different because it is the ultimate expression of the post-war UN system. It is the court of the United Nations.
And it has declared it a genocide. And the powers laugh at it. They don't take the ICJ's position on the Israel-Gaza conflict, euphemism. They don't take ICJ's position seriously.
Well, again, sorry, Jules, I have to disagree with that because ICJ hasn't yet ruled on the issue of genocide. What it's done is it's laid out provisional measures which it wants the Israeli government to take. Israeli government just ignored them. So that's why you said it's a joke.
They've intensified.
But that will then play into the final decision of the ICJ in a year or two or three, I don't know how many, when, in my view, it's almost certain that the ICJ will rule that Israel committed genocide in Gaza. To me, that is an incredibly important step, because
but
it's
it
not...
won't stop the violence.
Well, it may not. Obviously, it's not going to stop it this year. But the point is that it sends a very powerful signal, not just to Israel, which will no doubt ignore it, it sends a powerful signal to those countries that have been giving unconditional support to Israel. It's no accident that my country, the United Kingdom, which has been one of the strongest supporters of the Israeli government in its war in Gaza and with the genocide, has now realized that it could be accused of being complicit in international war crimes when the ICJ finally rules. So what does it do? It started to impose a small number of sanctions, a small number of suspensions of... It's not enough, but it's the beginning of a recognition that when the ICJ rules that Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza, that has huge implications for themselves as the individuals who carried out the acts that made the UK or the US complicit in that genocide. So I don't accept it's a joke.
You clearly believe strongly in a rules-based world order.
Well, there has to be, because otherwise you're back to a Hobbesian world where life is nasty, brutal and short. No, we don't want that. But we are moving from one paradigm to another. It's going to be messy getting there. And in the process we'll have this multipolar world where people interpret it differently. But we have to get there.
Did Belize make a mistake in taking its territorial dispute to the ICJ?
Well, I'm glad it's not Assad Schuman sitting here answering that question.
I would never.
No, I don't think they did make a mistake. I think that they'd run out of all other options. The ICJ has been on the table ever since the ICJ was created in 1945. It's just that at one moment Guatemala wanted it and then it didn't want it. At one moment the British wanted it and then they didn't want it. At one moment Belize, and so on. But finally the stars are aligned. Both countries wanted it. We had the referendum in both countries. And I think when the ICJ ruling, which will be straightforward, it will be in Belize's favor. When that comes, I think it will have done not just Belize a favor, it will have done Guatemala a favor, because the Guatemalan ruling class has been looking for ways of getting out of this conundrum for decades. And the best way is to have some outside body like the ICJ tell them, right, this is the boundary, this is what is Belize, this is what is Guatemala. It reminds me of the IMF. Often governments like to complain about the IMF, but secretly they rather like it when the IMF says you have to do this, you have to do that, because then they can't be blamed themselves. They say, oh, the IMF made us do it. For Guatemala, I think the ICJ ruling will be exactly like that. It will have done them a favor.
Do you think that it will realistically change anything on the ground?
Oh yes, because Guatemala is not a lawless state. Guatemala actually, despite its history of military dictatorships and all that, does respect international law. And when the ICJ says this is the boundary, and you on this side have to respect it, and you on this side have to respect it, then it's much easier for the Belize government and the BDF and the other security agencies to ask for Guatemala's help. You won't get the problems on the South Dune that we've had up to now once the ICJ rules. That is my confident prediction.
Secretary of State Rubio has met with the leaders of, I believe, every CARICOM nation and most Central American nation. But he has not met with the leader of Belize or the foreign minister. How should we interpret this? Is it a slight, or is it that we are that insignificant?
I don't think it's a slight. I think they've had telephone conversation, and obviously both Prime Minister Briceño and Marco Rubio are very busy people, and I don't think we should read too much into that. Because, look, the US is not shy of telling you if there's something which it doesn't like. It doesn't do it by refusing to meet you and not explaining why it refused to meet you. If there was some issue that was really irritating the United States about Belize's behavior, oh yes, you'd know by now, Jules. You'd know by now. And they have many ways of doing it. They can either get on the phone and tell you, or they can put you on the naughty step for something to do with people trafficking or something like that, which has probably nothing to do with people trafficking, but everything to do with the issue that they are concerned about.
You spoke earlier about the Cuban medical brigades, or you alluded to it earlier. Those are two policies of the Trump administration that directly affect Belize.
What's the other one?
The other one is deportation.
Deportation, yeah.
Deportation has a significant effect on Belize because it ends remittances in many cases. On the upside, it sends home productive labor, if they can be productively harnessed here in Belize. But how do you see these two policies of the Trump administration, and how can Belize maximize them to its advantage?
Well, I'm not sure that I would put it quite like that. I think the Cuban Medical Brigade, Belize handled that very well. And it was able to point out that these were not slave labor, that they were paid directly by the Belize government. And they got Marco Rubio, who after all is a Cuban American who is viscerally hostile to the Cuban government. They got him to more or less understand that. And they were able to do that because other countries in the CARICOM were able to do the same. So he got the message. After all, Marco Rubio wants the votes of CARICOM countries in the UN for all sorts of reasons, and it's not in his interest to entirely see a breakdown of the relationship over this. So I think Belize handled that extremely well. The deportation issue is quite different. There is no way, given the strength of feeling of the MAGA crowd, that Belize is going to say, don't deport Belizeans. They will deport Belizeans. What I think Belize has to do is to work through the consequences of that. You see, if people are coming back from the US to Belize, that means almost certainly they're not going to be going from Belize to the United States. And when you look at net migration, Belize is unusual because it has inward migration, not outward migration. Now that net inward migration is going to increase if you've got people coming back but not able to leave. And so Belize is going to have a larger number of people every year as net migrants, in addition to the population growth it already has, which is from births being greater than deaths. So you could see an increase in the rate of growth of Belize's population, which is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on many other factors. But it's something that authorities here need to take into account, because I don't think this policy on deportation is going to change. It's very popular with the people who voted for Donald Trump, and they are thrilled about it.
Now, in this economic history of Belize that we've discussed earlier, it traces the long history of extractive wealth here in Belize, which I argue continues in the tourism sector. We don't have timber or logwood anymore in those types of numbers, in the volume that would attract extractors. However, real estate is the wealth of this country. Property is the wealth of this country. And the fact is that a large portion of our most valuable real estate is held are owned by foreign interests. And the reason for this is, the higher the values, the more wealth is needed to purchase it. Does Belize face a situation where we will become laborers in our own country, in terms of, obviously, we all labor, but just the means of real wealth production will be so concentrated in the hands of foreign interests that the best an average person can hope for is to simply work for these rich landed interests?
Well, yes, of course it's a risk. But it's a risk not just because of the foreigners accumulating land, but because there has been, I think, a big increase in income and wealth inequality in Belize, which allows a small number of Belizeans at the top of the income distribution to do exactly the same thing. But we're talking about small numbers, so your argument remains that if this process continues unabated without restrictions and so on, there is a very real risk of what you've described. Many years ago, I hoped to write a book called Who Owns Belize? And it would have focused very much on the land issue. I'm too old to write that book now, and I don't have access to the right sources and so on. But I do know that the new institute at the University of Belize, Belpre, is interested in that topic, and I wish them well, because I think that we need to really update the work that was done on land ownership in the 1970s so that it takes account of these new realities. And then Belize may have to confront a very uncomfortable truth, which is that land ownership is highly concentrated in the hands of foreigners. Belize does something which other countries in this region, even right-wing governments, didn't do, and that is allowed access to its coastal areas. At the Keys, for example, for foreigners to purchase. Honduras doesn't allow that, and it's not just because it now has a left-wing government. It never did that. In Thailand, where one of my children lives, they do not allow foreigners to own property, particularly along the coast. I can remember a conversation I had with Bobby Leslie back 40 years ago, and the topic of Ambergris Caye came up, and he said, "Oh, we've lost that. That's gone to the foreigners." 40 years ago, Jules. So,
he was talking about the windward side. We've now lost the leeward side as well. It's fully gone. Yeah.
You may be right.
And the north. But so we'll take our final commercial break now. When we come back, we will take 3 questions with a preference given to students. I have spoken too much, but I'm sure they have far more interesting insights and analysis. So we'll take our final commercial break now, and we'll be back with 3 questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Stay tuned to UnCut.
Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Run them jewels fast, Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them slow mo. Hey.
Our final portion of the show. Usually at this time we have a concluding remarks or thoughts, but because this is our first Uncut with an audience, and it is live from the UB Auditorium in Bulmer-Thomas. We're talking about navigating a path in the Trump era. We want to invite, we have a audience with many bright young minds, far brighter than mine, and we want to ask them to offer a few questions. We'll take 4 questions to our guest, Victor Bulmer-Thomas, and about his view on any subject that they choose. So Amanda, take it over, and please, let's have the young people ask enlightened questions.
Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Bulmer-Thomas. My name is Rosana Castillo. I'm a UB student. So I have about 1 or 2 questions. My first question was when you said about Honduras not allowing foreigners to own the islands. And I actually want to know your thoughts on Roatan, how there's a large expat community there that's kind of affecting the locals on that island. And the other question is about Trump's unpredictability. This is Trump's second term in which, per the US Constitution, does not allow someone to be elected more than twice. He doesn't really have to worry about being re-elected again or many political consequences. And due to Trump's unpredictability, there's been a term about him called TACO, standing for Trump Always Chickens Out. So I want to know your thoughts on how Belize and other third countries, say Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica, and even smaller nations than Belize, like St. Lucia or Dominica, can handle what Trump will do and to who for the next 4 years. Thank you.
Well, as if I've understood you correctly, the first issue is a very interesting one because the relatively privileged position that expats have on the Belizean Keys is a troubling one. And as I said to Jules earlier on, that would not be allowed in most countries. And in my more wicked moments, it does remind me of the history of Hawaii or Texas, actually, where settlers came in and initially worked in terms of the economy, but then gradually moved into politics and then found ways of changing the arrangements and leading to annexation by the United States. Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States is about to annex Ambergris Caye, but that process under which expats don't confine themselves to the economy but move into local politics is something that Belizeans should think about, actually, and wonder whether the process has perhaps gone too far or what have you. On the second question, you're quite right that a president who doesn't face re-election has certain degrees of freedom that ought to enable them to be a bit bolder in, for example, standing up to Israel. I mean, why shouldn't Trump stand up to Israel if he doesn't depend on Zionist funders for his future election. The trouble is that he is so beholden to many of these funders that it's impossible to imagine him breaking away from them. They've been part of his political and economic life for so long, I can't see it happening. But he's also very conscious about his legacy, and he would want to make sure that someone like-minded, someone like J.D. Vance, succeeds him as president next time round. So that also will affect the degrees of freedom with which he can operate. But that he has some, that he has more than if he was in a first term, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Good morning, and thank you for being here at UB. My name is Rashid Palacio. My question is, as the Belize-US relations continue to evolve, what strategies do you foresee Belize adopting to diversify its international partnership and reduce reliance on the US?
Very good question. And I think Belize deserves credit for the way in which it has tried, with a relatively small diplomatic corps, to diversify its international relations. But clearly there is more that can be done, although that may need an expansion of the foreign service, of the diplomatic service. There are far too few countries in South America, for example, with which Belize has resident ambassadors, and that is a very natural place that Belize could and should be looking. I think when it comes to diversification of trade, which is also part of these diplomatic relations, the missing link is Mexico. We know there's a partial trade agreement with Guatemala. We know there's a partial trade agreement being worked on with El Salvador. But frankly, they pale into insignificance compared with the benefits that would come from some sort of a trade agreement with Mexico, particularly if it could be restricted to the 3 states that make up the Yucatan Peninsula, Quintana Roo, Yucatan and Campeche. I think that's an area where Belize needs to do much more, and indeed should find itself with a relatively sympathetic partner with the Sheinbaum administration in Mexico.
Yes, good afternoon. Just so you know, today we found very engaging. I'm not one of the young minds that Jules mentioned, a little bit older. Some actually call me Jules when I let my hair down. But I wanted to talk to you about opportunities. I see in my mind being that the U.S. is doing several things to disenfranchise students, such as student loans and also going after universities. I see this as an opportunity for universities in Belize to reach out, to provide opportunities for either online or face-to-face education, being that the cost of education here, even in US dollars, is about 1/4 of what it would be there. Do you see this as a viable path for universities in Belize to go out and recruit students from the United States?
I do, but you need to be quick about it, because unfortunately many other countries have come to the same conclusion. So all over Europe, governments who claim to be closely allied with the United States are desperately looking at ways in which they can attract the best and the brightest, not just the students, but also the staff, to move from the United States to their country. But I agree with you, actually, that I think there is an opportunity here for Belize. And even if the numbers that come is not huge, it doesn't matter. Belize is a small country. And so when you get a small number, it can make a big impact.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. This is really the first time I come out here, and very insightful topics. When I came in, you mentioned that the U.S. was an empire in retreat. I agree with you. It's still a powerful military country, and they still have the dollar as the global currency reserve. I think the U.S. uses the SWIFT system as its weapon to exert influence in many different countries. You spoke about the multimodal sort of rails are being created to diversify from that. My question to you is, how do you justify the contradictory stance of Trump with cryptocurrencies and inviting cryptocurrencies into the global market when you really should be trying to, stay within the rails of the SWIFT system, which is what I think is one of the only tools left?
That's a very good question. I'll try and answer it as best I can, because it's one that obviously we've all had to think about. Just to backtrack a little bit, on the question of dollar hegemony, it's not just Trump, it's many of those who support the notion of US global hegemony empire who realize that the dollar is the key to everything. And that's why Trump was so adamant that he would almost go to war with the BRICS countries if they tried to replace the dollar with BRICS currency in terms of their international trade and capital flows. I mean, it was out of all proportion to the threat, because first of all, they didn't say they were going to do that, and secondly, the BRICS countries are not anti-US. Now, they may end up being anti-US if the US takes steps which are against their interests, but they didn't form the BRICS to be anti the United States. So the dollar is the key. So then when you, as you say, you see crypto coming along and being promoted by Trump, and remember, he used to be very against crypto, right? I think we have to remember two things. One is, Trump, of course, is a businessman. He's not just a politician. And he has personal interests. And he launched his own meme coin the day before he was inaugurated. And suddenly his wealth went from a mere 3 or 4 billion to about 25 billion. And Melania did the same thing the next day. So, you have to be careful about assuming that Trump is only a politician. He's both a politician and a businessman. But also within that coalition I spoke about are many people like David Sachs who are extremely keen on crypto, who have promoted it for their own business reasons. And of course Trump is beholden to every faction within this coalition, not just the MAGA crowd, but to the tech billionaires, the cryptocurrency crowd, the Zionist funders and so on. He has to satisfy, or he thinks he has to satisfy all of them. And I think some of the measures, like with the crypto, and with companies like Palantir and Peter Thiel, these are things that he does because he has to feel that he has to satisfy the different constituencies within his coalition. It's not a pretty sight, but to be honest, politics is often like that, and you have these coalitions where the leader has to find ways of meeting all their concerns.
Okay, thanks for those excellent questions. And with that, we come to the end of our show, but I just want to ask you for your final thoughts on Belize navigating its future in the age of Trump. I know you've spoke extensively on it, but if you had to distill or crystallize all the wisdom you have shared with us, what would it be?
Well, I would take a long view, and I'd look at this as a historian. And with my wife, Barbara, we have often talked about this topic, how Belize has faced existential threats throughout its existence, first as an illegal settlement under not just Spanish law, but British law, and secondly, when it was under threat from the Spanish during the period when it was a British settlement, and then through the threat from Guatemala and all the rest of it. And somehow it has found a way of navigating these existential threats. And what is coming from the United States is not really an existential threat. It's not as bad as that. And I think Belize will be able to draw on the collective wisdom of those centuries of navigating very difficult international situations. You know, remember, in this country, people were often marched out of the colony by the Spanish in order to restore what the Spain saw as Spanish sovereignty. So they came back, and Belize survived. So I honestly think that Belize, with wisdom, with calmness, and thinking strategically and looking ahead, will be able to navigate this situation.
Excellent summation. Thank you, Victor. We have to thank our sponsors. But first, let me mention your two books which I am aware of at this time are Empire in Retreat and, very important for Belize, From Slavery to Services, The Struggle for Economic Independence in the Caribbean. We have the picture and we'll have it up on screen shortly. So those are, in my mind, both very important reading for anyone interested in these subjects. We want to thank our sponsors: Benny's Home Center, Cellular World Belize, Creative Marketing, Galenia Hospital, Nando's Wholesale, Smart, Universal Hardware, University of Belize, Debari in Belmopan, KD Productions for this large rig, large ancillary production equipment we have here. It wouldn't have been possible at all without them. LED Belize for the superb screen and keeping everything going on the screen. And we want to thank all those who came. It's after rice hours in Belize, 12:20. I thank you all for staying. I hope it wasn't a requirement of your class, but we have a wide cross-section of people, and I'm grateful to everyone. This has been the first Chairman's Forum, UnCut Live from UB in Belmopan. Hopefully it won't be the last. I know you have an engagement here at the university, I believe,
on
with
Tuesday.
PRI,
yes.
On the 24th.
That's right.
On the 24th. So if you want to see him, PRI is posting their event here at the university as well. So you can join them for that. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again on UnCut sometime in the future, indeterminate.